Deep in the Montana wilderness, where winter can kill and solitude shapes a man's soul, 23-year-old Samuel lives alone in his grandfather's cabin. He knows every trail, every sound the forest makes, every way to survive when civilization feels like a distant memory. His days follow a simple rhythm of chopping wood, hunting game, and tending his small garden. But on this particular October evening, as the first snow begins to fall, he discovers something that will shatter his quiet existence forever. She emerges from the tree line like a ghost, stumbling through the underbrush with torn clothes and blood on her hands. No memory of her name, no recollection of how she arrived in these remote mountains. Just fear in her eyes and the desperate need for shelter before the storm hits. When Samuel approaches her with gentle words, he has no idea that his simple invitation will unlock secrets that could destroy them both. What truth is her lost memory protecting them from? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Samuel had learned the mountain's moods, like a man learns the temperament of a beloved wife. At dawn, she whispered through the pines with gentle encouragement. By midday, she offered steady companionship in the rustle of leaves and distant bird calls. Come evening, she settled into comfortable silence, broken only by the occasional crack of settling timber or the far-off howl of wolves. This morning felt different. The air carried an electric tension that made the hair on his arms stand on end, though he couldn't name why. He'd woken before sunrise, as was his custom, and stepped onto the covered porch of his grandfather's cabin with a steaming cup of coffee. The structure stood solid and weathered, built from lodge pole pine that had seasoned for decades into something harder than steel. Every board, every joint, every carefully chinked gap between logs told the story of a man who understood that in these mountains, your shelter meant the difference between life and death. His grandfather, Thomas Whitehorse, had built this place with his own hands in 1967, carrying lumber up the mountain trail one board at a time on an old pack mule named Stubborn Pete. The cabin sat in a natural clearing at 7,000 feet elevation, surrounded by dense stands of Douglas fir and white bark pine. To the west, the land dropped away in a series of granite cliffs that offered spectacular views of the valley below. To the east, the slope climbed gradually toward the Continental Divide, where snow lingered year-round on the highest peaks. Samuel touched the leather journal that never left his shirt pocket. His grandfather's careful handwriting filled every page with observations about weather patterns, animal behavior, seasonal changes, and the thousand small details that separated those who thrived in the wilderness from those who merely survived. "The mountain will teach you everything you need to know," Thomas had written on the first page, "but only if you listen with more than your ears." The old man had raised Samuel from age 14, after the car accident that claimed both his parents on a rain-slicked highway outside Billings. Samuel's father had been Thomas's only son, a man who'd chosen city life over mountain wisdom, though he'd brought his boy to visit every summer. Those childhood visits had planted seeds that flowered into deep knowledge when Samuel came to live here permanently. 9 years had passed since Thomas died quietly in his sleep during a February blizzard. Samuel had been 20 when he found himself truly alone for the first time, inheriting not just the cabin, but the responsibility of maintaining a life his grandfather had spent 50 years perfecting. The learning curve had been steep. That first winter nearly killed him twice, once when he fell through ice while checking trap lines, and again when carbon monoxide from a poorly maintained chimney nearly suffocated him in his sleep. But the mountain had indeed taught him, just as Thomas promised. Samuel learned to read the subtle signs that predicted weather changes days in advance. He mastered the art of preserving meat without refrigeration, growing vegetables in short mountain summers, and finding water even during drought years. His hands grew skilled at carpentry, his eyes sharp for tracking game, his body lean and strong from the constant physical demands of mountain life. The woman's arrival shattered this carefully ordered existence like a stone through glass. Samuel had been returning from checking his snare lines along Willow Creek when he heard the sound that didn't belong. Crashing through underbrush, desperate and clumsy, nothing like the careful movement of wildlife. He'd approached cautiously, rifle ready, expecting perhaps a wounded deer or an aggressive bear. Instead, he found her collapsed against a massive pine tree, breathing in short, panicked gasps. Her designer coat, now torn and stained, told him immediately that she came from another world entirely. The fabric looked expensive, something you'd see in magazine advertisements, not something meant for wilderness travel. Blood seeped through the material at her shoulder, and scratches covered her face and hands where branches had torn at her during her desperate flight through the forest. But it was her eyes that stopped Samuel in his tracks, wide with terror, darting constantly toward the tree line as if expecting pursuit at any moment. When she saw him approaching, she pressed herself harder against the tree trunk, making herself as small as possible. "Please," she whispered, her voice hoarse from exhaustion and fear. "Please don't hurt me." Samuel slowly lowered his rifle and raised both hands to show they were empty. In his grandfather's journal, Thomas had written about the importance of reading people as carefully as you read the weather. This woman carried trauma like a physical weight, and whatever had driven her into these mountains had left scars deeper than the visible wounds. "I'm not going to hurt you," Samuel said softly, keeping his distance. "My name is Samuel. I live near here." She studied his face with the desperate intensity of someone whose survival depended on correctly judging character. Whatever she saw, there must have offered some reassurance, because her rigid posture relaxed slightly. "I don't know," she said, touching her forehead with a trembling hand. "I can't remember how I got here." Samuel noticed the silver locket clutched in her other hand, its chain broken, the surface stained with dried blood. When she saw him looking at it, she instinctively hid it against her chest. The first snowflakes began to fall. The snow fell harder as Samuel helped her to the cabin. She moved like someone fighting through invisible quicksand, each step requiring enormous effort. Her breathing came in shallow gasps that sent small puffs of vapor into the cold air. Samuel matched her pace, staying close enough to catch her if she stumbled, but far enough away to avoid triggering her obvious fear of being trapped. Inside the warm cabin, she collapsed into the wooden chair nearest the door, as if she needed to know escape remained possible. Samuel lit the oil lamps that cast dancing shadows across the log walls, then knelt beside the stone fireplace to coax the banked coals back to life. The familiar ritual of feeding kindling to flames gave him time to think while she sat in stunned silence. When he turned back, she was staring at the torn designer coat in her lap. The fabric looked completely out of place in his rustic cabin, like finding an orchid growing in a pine forest. She touched the material with confusion, as if seeing it for the first time. "This isn't mine," she whispered, then immediately looked uncertain. I don't think it's mine." Samuel poured hot coffee from the pot that stayed warm beside the fire. "Can you tell me your name?" She closed her eyes, pressing her fingers against her temples. "Sarah, no, that's not right. Susan." I can almost hear someone saying it, but the voice sounds angry. Her eyes snapped open, filled with sudden panic. "Why can't I remember?" "Easy," Samuel said gently, offering her the coffee. "Sometimes the mind protects itself by forgetting things that hurt too much to remember." She accepted the cup with trembling hands, wrapping her fingers around the warmth. "You sound like you know about that. My grandfather used to say that memory and pain walk hand in hand. Sometimes you have to let one go to escape the other." The coffee seemed to steady her somewhat. She looked around the cabin with growing awareness, taking in the hand-hewn furniture, the shelves lined with preserving jars, the rifles mounted above the mantel. "You really live here alone?" "For 9 years now. Inherited it from my grandfather. No electricity, no phone, no need for either. The mountain provides everything necessary for life." She studied his face, as if trying to understand how someone could choose such isolation. "Aren't you lonely?" Samuel considered the question while adding larger logs to the fire. Loneliness comes from being disconnected from what matters. The mountain connects me to something larger than myself. But don't you miss people? Conversation, companionship? I have both when I need them. There's a trading post about 15 miles down the mountain where I go for supplies. Old Pete Williams runs it, and his wife Martha makes the best apple pie in 3 counties. But mostly I find that people complicate things unnecessarily. She sipped her coffee, watching him with growing curiosity. How old are you? 23. You talk like someone much older, Samuel smiled. Living up here ages you in some ways, keeps you young in others. You leer. What's truly important pretty quickly when your survival depends on making good decisions. A sudden crash outside made her drop the coffee cup. It shattered against the wooden floor. She shot to her feet, wild panic returning to her eyes. Samuel moved quickly to the window, scanning the darkening forest. A dead branch had fallen under the weight of accumulating snow, nothing more. It's okay, he said, turning back to find her pressed against the far wall, shaking uncontrollably. Just a tree branch, but she wasn't hearing him. Her breathing had become rapid and shallow, her eyes fixed on something only she could see. He's coming, she whispered. He always finds me, always. Samuel approached slowly, as he would a wounded animal. Who's coming? I can't remember his face, but I remember the fear. The way he looked at me, like I was something he owned. She slid down the wall until she was sitting on the floor, knees drawn up to her chest. The silver locket fell from her pocket, its broken chain glinting in the firelight. Samuel knelt beside it, studying the ornate engravings on its surface. Expensive work, custom-made, may I? He asked, gesturing toward the locket. She nodded reluctantly. Samuel opened it carefully, revealing a photograph so water-damaged that the faces were barely recognizable. A woman and a man, dressed formally, the woman's smile looking forced even through the damage. This might be you, Samuel said, showing her the photograph. She stared at it with growing distress. I remember the dress, blue silk. It felt like wearing a costume. Her voice dropped to a whisper. The wedding dress. The pieces began forming a picture that made Samuel's jaw tighten. A wealthy marriage, fear of a husband, a desperate escape into wilderness where she clearly didn't belong. Someone had been hunting her, and she'd run so far and so fast that she'd nearly killed herself getting free. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the cabin's windows. The storm was getting worse, which meant they'd be trapped together for at least several days. Samuel looked at this broken woman sitting on his floor and felt something shift inside his chest. She needed protection, and he was perhaps the only person in 50 miles capable of providing it. What's the last thing you remember clearly? He asked. Over the next 3 days, Samuel watched her slowly emerge from the shell of terror she'd worn when he found her. The blizzard had indeed trapped them in the cabin, but the forced proximity seemed to ease her fears rather than heighten them. Perhaps it was the complete isolation that comforted her, knowing that no one could reach them through the wall of wind and snow. He'd given her his grandfather's room, the smaller of the 2 bedrooms, after changing the sheets and adding extra quilts. The first night, he'd heard her crying softly through the thin wall. But by the second night, the sounds had shifted to restless sleep rather than active distress. By the 3rd morning, she emerged from the bedroom looking almost human again. I should help, she said, watching Samuel prepare breakfast over the wood-burning stove. I can't just sit here while you do everything. Samuel glanced at her soft hands, manicured nails that had never known hard work. You're still recovering. Rest is important. I feel useless. Feeling useless and being useless are different things. But if you want to help, there's always something that needs doing. He showed her how to tend the fire, explaining the difference between hardwood for long burning and softwood for quick heat. Her first attempts were clumsy, but she listened carefully to his instructions and asked thoughtful questions. When she managed to coax a dying ember back to full flame, the smile that lit her face was the first genuine expression of joy he'd seen from her. I did it, she said, sounding surprised. Fire is life up here, Samuel replied. My grandfather used to say that a person who can make fire will never be helpless. Over the following days, he taught her other basic skills. How to pump water from the well without breaking the mechanism in freezing weather. How to identify which preserved foods would provide the most nutrition during winter months. How to read the subtle changes in air pressure that predicted weather shifts. She absorbed the lessons with an intensity that surprised him. Her fear seemed to transform into determination, as if mastering these practical skills built a foundation of confidence she'd never possessed. When she successfully prepared a meal using only ingredients from the root cellar, she looked as proud as if she'd climbed a mountain. "I've never cooked anything from scratch before," she admitted, watching Samuel taste the simple stew she'd made. "We always had staff for that. We." She paused, ladle halfway to her mouth. "I said we, didn't I? I don't know why. The memory feels like looking through fog." Samuel had been carving while they talked, shaping a piece of mountain maple with his grandfather's old knife. The wood was dense and fine-grained, perfect for detailed work. As they shared the meal she'd prepared, he continued working, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. "What are you making?" she asked. "A cup. The coffee mugs are too heavy for someone recovering from trauma. This will be lighter, easier to hold." She watched his hands shape the wood, fascinated by the way he seemed to find the cup that already existed inside the raw material. "How did you learn to do that?" "My grandfather taught me. He said that working with wood teaches patience and respect for living things. Even dead, a tree continues to serve if you treat it with proper reverence. He sounds like he was a wise man." He was. Spent 50 years learning how to live in harmony with this place. "Most of what I know I learned from him. Did he ever get lonely, living up here alone?" Samuel paused in his carving. "He wasn't always alone. My grandmother lived here too, until she died when I was 12. After that, yes, I think he was lonely sometimes. But he used to say that loneliness and solitude were different animals entirely. Solitude was a choice that brought peace. Loneliness was what happened when you felt disconnected from the world around you. Which one are you?" "Solitary, mostly, though having you here has made me realize how much I miss conversation." She smiled, and Samuel noticed how the expression transformed her entire face. "I like talking with you. You listen differently than most people." "How so?" "Like you're hearing more than just words. Like you're trying to understand what I mean, not just what I'm saying." Samuel tested the smoothness of the cup's rim with his thumb. The wood had taken on a warm glow under the careful attention of his knife. "My grandfather taught me that too. He said most people listen just long enough to formulate their response. Real listening means being quiet inside yourself so you can hear what the other person actually needs. What do you think I need?" Samuel looked up from his work, meeting her eyes across the small table. "Safety, time to heal. And maybe the chance to discover who you really are when you're not afraid." She was quiet for a long moment, turning her coffee cup in small circles on the wooden surface. "I don't think I've ever felt safe before." "Not really. Even as a child, there was always this feeling that something bad was waiting to happen." "You're safe here," Samuel said simply. "How can you be so certain?" "Because I won't let anyone hurt you." The words hung in the air between them, carrying more weight than either had expected. Samuel returned to his carving, but his ears had turned slightly red. She studied his profile as he worked, noting the strong line of his jaw, the steady confidence in his movements, the complete absence of the predatory energy she'd learned to fear in men. When he finished the cup, he handed it to her without ceremony. The wood was smooth as silk, perfectly balanced, warming quickly in her hands. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "It's yours." The heavy snows of December trapped them completely. Samuel had experienced isolation before, but never with another person whose presence seemed to fill every corner of the cabin with new energy. She'd taken to calling herself Grace, though she admitted the name felt borrowed rather than remembered. "It's what I want to be," she explained one evening as they sat before the fire. "Graceful, gracious, someone who moves through the world without causing harm." "You don't cause harm," Samuel said, looking up from the rifle he was cleaning. His grandfather's old Winchester lay disassembled on the table, each piece receiving careful attention. You don't know what I've done. What I might have done before I came here. I know who you are now. That's what matters. She watched him work with the same fascination she showed for all his practical skills. The way he handled the weapon spoke of deep familiarity and respect, not the casual violence she associated with men and guns. My grandfather taught me that a rifle is a tool, like an axe or a saw, Samuel explained, noting her attention. It provides food, protects the home, but only when treated with proper respect. A man who doesn't respect his weapons is dangerous to everyone around him. Have you ever had to use it against a person? Samuel's hands paused in their work. No, but I would if someone threatened what I care about. The weight of that statement settled between them. Grace understood that she now fell into the category of things Samuel cared about protecting. The knowledge brought comfort and confusion in equal measure. She'd never experienced protection that didn't come with strings attached, demands for gratitude, expressed in ways that made her skin crawl. "Tell me about your grandfather," she said, settling into the chair across from him with her wooden cup filled with pine needle tea. Samuel's expression softened, as it always did, when he spoke of Thomas. "He was the strongest man I ever knew, but not in the way most people think of strength. He had this ability to remain calm no matter what happened. I saw him set his own broken leg once, after a horse threw him, and he talked me through helping him as if we were discussing the weather." "How old were you?" 16. Old enough to be useful, but young enough to panic. He kept me steady by staying steady himself. Grace tried to imagine growing up with that kind of steady, masculine presence. Her own father had been absent more often than not, and when he was home, the house filled with tension that made everyone walk on eggshells. "He sounds like he really loved you." He did. But he also made sure I earned that love by becoming someone worthy of it. No free rides, no excuses for laziness or poor judgment. He used to say that love without standards wasn't love at all, just sentiment. Outside, the wind howled with particular ferocity, rattling the cabin's windows and sending snow spiraling past in sheets. Grace had learned to read these mountain storms over the past weeks. This one would last at least 2 days, possibly 3. "Are you worried about supplies?" she asked. "No, my grandfather planned for much worse than this. There's enough food stored to last 6 months if necessary, and enough firewood for a full winter." He believed in being prepared for anything, including strangers showing up in the forest. Samuel smiled. "Especially strangers. He always said the mountains would send you what you needed, but sometimes what you needed came in unexpected packages." Grace felt her cheeks warm. "Is that what I am? Something you needed?" The question hung in the air, while Samuel reassembled the rifle with practiced efficiency. When he finished, he leaned the weapon against the wall and turned to face her directly. "I didn't know I needed anything until you arrived. I thought I was complete living up here alone. But these past weeks have shown me how much I was missing." "What were you missing?" "Purpose beyond survival. Someone to share the small moments that make life meaningful. The satisfaction of teaching someone else what I've learned. And what have I been missing?" Samuel studied her face in the firelight. "Peace, I think. The chance to exist without fear. Permission to discover who you are when you're not performing for someone else." Grace set down her cup and walked to the window, watching the snow fall in the lamplight. "I have memories sometimes, fragments of a life where everything I did was watched and judged, where my value depended on how well I pleased someone whose approval could never really be earned." "That's not life," Samuel said quietly. "That's a kind of prison." "Yes," she turned back to him. "But I'm not in prison anymore, am I?" "No, you're free." The simple statement carried enormous weight. Grace had never thought of herself as free before, not truly. Even as a child, she'd been shaped by expectations and demands that left no room for her own desires or dreams. "What does someone do with freedom?" she asked. "Whatever they choose. That's what makes it freedom." She returned to her chair, drawing her knees up and wrapping her arms around them. The pose made her look younger, more vulnerable. "I choose to stay here," she said softly. "At least for now. If you'll have me." Samuel's response came without hesitation. "I'd like that very much." Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the cabin, something warm and precious was taking root. The photograph fell from between the pages of his grandfather's copy of Walden like a leaf dropping from a tree. Grace had been organizing the bookshelf, a task she'd taken on to feel useful during the long winter days when the slim volume tilted and released its hidden contents. She knelt to retrieve it, then froze. The image was clearer than the damaged one in her locket, shot with professional lighting that captured every detail. A woman in an elegant emerald gown stood beside a man in an expensive tuxedo. The woman's smile looked painted on, her eyes holding the same trapped quality Grace recognized from mirrors in her fragmented memories. "Samuel," she called, her voice strangely flat. He emerged from the kitchen where he'd been preparing lunch, took one look at her face, and immediately crossed to kneel beside her. When he saw the photograph, his expression darkened. "Where did this come from?" "Your grandfather's book. It was hidden inside." Grace's hands trembled as she held the image. "That's me, isn't it?" And him. The man in the photograph commanded attention in ways that made Samuel's skin crawl. Everything about him spoke of power and control, from his perfectly groomed appearance to the possessive way his hand gripped the woman's waist. His smile looked cold, calculated, more threat than expression of joy. "Do you remember him now?" Samuel asked gently. Grace stared at the photograph with growing horror. "Richard. Richard Blackwood. Oh God, how could I forget that name?" The memories came flooding back like water through a broken dam. The whirlwind courtship that had felt like being swept away by a force of nature. The lavish wedding that resembled a business merger more than a celebration of love. The gradual realization that she'd become a possession rather than a partner. "He owns half the mining operations in 3 states, she whispered. "Oil, gas, timber. Everyone says he's a brilliant businessman, but I saw how he treated people who couldn't fight back. Employees who questioned him, suppliers who couldn't meet his demands." Samuel studied the man's face, memorizing features with the careful attention he usually reserved for tracking dangerous wildlife. "What was he like as a husband?" Grace's laugh held no humor. "Controlling doesn't begin to cover it. He chose my clothes, my friends, how I spent every minute of every day. If I smiled too much at a waiter, I was flirting. If I didn't smile enough at his business associates, I was being rude. Nothing I did was ever quite right. How did you escape?" "There was a charity gala. I'd been planning it for months, one of the few things he let me organize. During the event, I heard him talking to one of his security people about having me followed, about cameras he'd had installed in our bedroom without telling me." She shuddered. "I realized I was living in a beautiful prison, and the walls were closing in." Samuel's jaw tightened. The thought of anyone treating Grace like a possession made his hands curl into fists. "So you ran?" I grabbed cash from his safe, took one of the cars, and drove as far as I could before abandoning it. Then I hiked into the mountains, thinking I could disappear long enough to figure out what to do next. She touched her forehead, where a faint scar remained. "I wasn't exactly prepared for wilderness survival. That's why you couldn't remember. Trauma, exhaustion, hypothermia. My mind was protecting me by forgetting. But seeing his face brings it all back." Grace looked up at Samuel with desperate eyes. "He won't stop looking for me." "Men like Richard don't accept losing what they consider theirs." Samuel took the photograph from her trembling hands and studied it again. Something about the man's expression bothered him beyond the obvious arrogance. There was a coldness there that spoke of someone capable of terrible things when crossed. "How long have you been missing?" "The gala was in early October. I've been gone almost 3 months. That's a long time for someone with resources to search. Richard has connections everywhere. Law enforcement, private investigators, politicians. He could make my disappearance look like anything he wanted." Samuel stood and walked to the fireplace, still holding the photograph. "He can't reach you here. This place doesn't exist on any official maps, and the nearest road is 15 miles away. You don't understand. He has helicopters, tracking specialists, military contacts. If he's determined enough, he'll find this place eventually." Samuel turned back to her, his expression resolute. "Then we'll be ready for him." "We? You're not facing this alone anymore, Grace. Whatever he is, wherever he comes from, he's not taking you back to that life." Grace felt tears she'd been holding back for months finally break free. "Why would you risk everything for someone you barely know?" Samuel knelt beside her again, taking her hands in his calloused ones. "Because I know enough. I know you're kind, intelligent, and stronger than you realize. I know you laugh at my terrible jokes and cry when you think no one's watching. I know you deserve to live without fear." He paused, meeting her eyes directly. "And because I love you." The words hung in the air like morning mist, precious and fragile. Grace had heard men claim to love her before, but always with conditions attached, always with expectations of what she owed in return. "You love me?" "I do. Not who you were or who you might become. I love who you are right now, sitting on my cabin floor with tears on your face and courage in your heart." Grace leaned forward and kissed him, tasting salt and hope and the promise of a future she'd never dared imagine possible. Spring arrived earlier than usual, and with it came the knowledge that their isolation would soon end. The snow that had protected them through the winter months now melted into rushing streams that would eventually connect to roads, to civilization, to the world where Richard Blackwood's influence reached. Samuel stood on the cabin's porch, watching Grace practice with the .22 rifle he'd given her to learn on. She'd developed steady hands over the past weeks, progressing from barely hitting the broadside of a tree to consistently striking targets at 50 yards. More importantly, she'd lost the flinch that came from associating weapons with violence rather than tools for survival. "Remember," Samuel called out. "Breathe in, let half out, then squeeze slowly." Grace adjusted her stance, sighted down the barrel and fired. The tin can she'd been aiming at disappeared in a satisfying clang. She turned back to him with a grin that transformed her entire face. "I'm getting better." "You're getting dangerous," Samuel replied with approval. "That's the point." He'd spent the last month teaching her everything his grandfather had taught him about defensive strategy. How to move silently through dense forest. How to create false trails that would confuse trackers. How to identify safe hiding spots and emergency supply caches. Most importantly, how to think like someone whose survival depended on outwitting better-equipped opponents. Grace had thrown herself into the training with an intensity that sometimes worried him. She attacked each lesson as if her life depended on mastering it completely, which they both knew. It very well might. "Show me the emergency supplies again," she said, setting the rifle aside. Samuel led her to a seemingly random spot in the forest, 50 yards from the cabin. He moved aside a carefully arranged pile of deadfall to reveal a metal box buried beneath. Inside were 3 days' worth of food, a hunting knife, ammunition, basic medical supplies, and detailed maps of escape routes his grandfather had scouted decades earlier. "There are 6 of these hidden within a mile of the cabin," Samuel explained. "Each one is marked by 2 crossed sticks that look natural unless you know what to look for." Grace memorized the location with the systematic attention she applied to everything now. "What if they come with dogs?" "Creek beds will break the scent trail. The water's cold enough this time of year to discourage most tracking animals from following for long distances. And if they come with helicopters. Dense canopy provides cover, and there are caves higher up the mountain where infrared won't penetrate." They'd had this conversation dozens of times, but Grace needed the repetition. Planning gave her a sense of control over a situation that could easily spiral beyond their ability to manage. Samuel watched her carefully catalogue each piece of information. The frightened woman he'd found in the forest had transformed into someone harder, more focused. Part of him mourned the loss of her earlier softness, but he understood the necessity. Richard Blackwood would not send gentlemen to retrieve his missing wife. "There's something else we need to discuss," Samuel said, leading her back toward the cabin. What? Marriage. Grace stopped walking. What about it? Legally, you're still married to him. That gives him certain rights in terms of claiming you. I know. I've thought about that. There are ways to change your legal status, but they require documentation you don't have. Birth certificate, social security card, proof of identity. Grace sank onto a fallen log, suddenly looking exhausted. I don't even know if Grace is legally my name now. I've been thinking of myself that way for so long, but I was born Catherine Walsh. I became Catherine Blackwood when I married Richard. Who do you want to be? Grace. Just Grace. Someone who exists independent of any man's name or permission. Samuel sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. Then that's who you'll be. We'll figure out the legal complications later, and if we can't, then you'll be Grace anyway. Names are just words. Who you are inside is what matters. She leaned against him, drawing comfort from his steady presence. I love you for saying that, but the law doesn't care about philosophy. No, but the law also can't reach us up here unless we let it. Grace turned to study his profile. You'd really be willing to live as outlaws? I'd be willing to live however necessary to keep you safe and free. The weight of his commitment settled around them like a warm blanket. Grace had never experienced love without conditions, without demands for gratitude or submission. Samuel offered protection that came with no strings attached, asking nothing in return except the chance to share her life. I need to tell you something, she said quietly. What? Before you found me, I was planning to die in these mountains. I thought disappearing completely was the only way to escape Richard's control. Samuel's arm tightened around him. And now? Now I want to live. Really live, not just survive. But I'm scared that wanting happiness makes me selfish, Grace. Samuel turned to face her directly. You deserve happiness. You deserve love that doesn't hurt. You deserve a life where your choices matter, even if those choices put you in danger. Especially then. Freedom that doesn't include the right to make dangerous choices isn't freedom at all. As if summoned by their conversation, the distant sound of helicopter rotors drifted across the valley. Both of them froze, listening to the mechanical rhythm that spoke of systematic search patterns. He's found us, Grace whispered. Samuel stood, his expression grim but determined. No, he's found this general area. There's a difference. The sound grew closer. The helicopter circled twice before landing in the clearing below the cabin. From their concealed position in the forest, Samuel and Grace watched 3 men emerge from the aircraft. 2 wore tactical gear and moved with military precision. The 3rd man stepped out slowly, adjusting his expensive suit as if he were arriving at a business meeting, rather than tracking his missing wife through wilderness. Richard Blackwood looked exactly as he had in the photograph, but seeing him in person revealed dimensions that pictures couldn't capture. He possessed the kind of presence that commanded attention, the confident bearing of someone accustomed to getting exactly what he wanted. When he spoke to his men, they listened with the deference of employees who understood the consequences of failure. Grace's hand found Samuel's, her fingers cold despite the spring warmth. I thought I was stronger now, she whispered. But seeing him again, you are stronger, Samuel replied quietly. You chose to run. You survived on your own. You learned to fight back. None of that changes because he's here. Through the scope of his grandfather's rifle, Samuel studied the tactical team. Professional mercenaries, not law enforcement. Richard was operating outside legal channels, which meant he planned to handle this situation without official oversight. That knowledge chilled Samuel more than the sight of their weapons. Mrs. Blackwood, Richard called out, his voice carrying easily across the clearing. I know you're here. These mountains can't hide you forever. Grace pressed herself lower against the forest floor, as if his voice alone could reveal their location. You've caused considerable worry, Catherine. Your family misses you. Your friends are concerned about your mental state. Samuel felt Grace flinch at the use of her given name, at the casual lies about people who cared. I've brought Dr. Morrison with me, Richard continued, gesturing to someone still in the helicopter. He's prepared to help you through this difficult episode. We all understand that you haven't been yourself lately. The implied threat was clear. Richard had constructed a narrative where Grace's disappearance resulted from mental illness rather than abuse. Any claims she made about her treatment would be dismissed as delusions requiring medical intervention. One of the tactical men approached the cabin, weapon ready. Samuel watched him examine the doorframe, noting signs of recent habitation. The man called something back to Richard, who nodded with satisfaction. "She's been living here," the mercenary reported. "Fresh supplies, recent cooking smells. Someone's been taking care of her." Richard's expression darkened. "Find whoever's been helping her. I want to have a conversation with this good Samaritan." Samuel and Grace retreated deeper into the forest, moving with the silent efficiency Samuel had learned from years of hunting. They reached the first emergency cache without detection, but Samuel knew their pursuers would find the cabin soon and begin expanding their search pattern. "We can't outrun them indefinitely," Grace whispered as Samuel retrieved supplies from the hidden box. "We don't need to outrun them. We need to outthink them." "How?" Samuel studied the terrain around them, his mind calculating distances and sight lines with tactical precision. "They're operating under the assumption that you're a victim who needs rescuing. They don't expect resistance. What are you thinking? Your husband brought a doctor and minimal security because he expects to find a helpless woman suffering from exposure and trauma. He's not prepared for an armed confrontation." Grace understood immediately. "You want to fight them. I want to change the terms of engagement. Right now they're hunting us. We need to become the hunters." From his grandfather's emergency supplies, Samuel retrieved items that hadn't seen use since Thomas's military service decades earlier. Smoke grenades, tripwires, small explosive charges designed for creating diversions rather than casualties. "My grandfather fought in Vietnam," Samuel explained, examining the vintage equipment. "He brought home more than just medals. Will this stuff still work?" Thomas maintained everything perfectly. He always said you never knew when old skills might become necessary again. Grace watched Samuel prepare the devices with practiced efficiency. "You know how to use military explosives?" "Thomas taught me everything he knew about asymmetric warfare, how to level the playing field when you're outnumbered and outgunned. Why would he teach you that?" Samuel's expression grew somber. "Because he understood that sometimes good people have to fight bad people, and bad people usually have better resources." A shout echoed from the direction of the cabin. "The search team had found their trail. They'll follow our footprints," Grace said. "Let them." Samuel shouldered the pack of emergency supplies. "We're going to lead them exactly where we want them to go." As they moved deeper into the mountains, Samuel began setting traps along their trail. Not deadly devices, but obstacles designed to slow pursuit and create confusion. A tripwire that would trigger a smoke grenade. Carefully weakened branches that would break under a man's weight. False trails that led to dead ends. "I never imagined I'd be planning military tactics," Grace said as they climbed toward higher ground. "You're not planning them. You're surviving them. There's a difference." Behind them, the first explosion echoed through the forest as someone triggered Samuel's smoke trap. Angry voices carried on the wind, followed by Richard's cold commands to his men. Grace reached into her pocket and pulled out her wedding ring, the diamond engagement ring that had once symbolized everything she thought she wanted. She looked at it for a long moment, then made a decision that felt like shedding an old skin. She threw the ring as hard as she could into the forest, watching it disappear among the trees like a falling star. The gesture felt like breaking chains she'd worn so long she'd forgotten they were there. "I'm not Catherine Blackwood anymore," she said firmly. "I'm Grace, and I choose to fight." 6 months later, Grace stood on the cabin's porch, watching Samuel return from checking the trap lines. Spring had given way to summer, and the mountain displayed its gentler face with wildflowers carpeting the meadows and streams running clear and cold from snowmelt. The confrontation with Richard had ended differently than anyone expected. When his mercenaries finally tracked them to the high country, They'd found themselves facing not a helpless woman and a simple mountain man, but two people who knew the terrain intimately and were willing to defend their freedom with everything they had. The turning point had come when Richard himself insisted on joining the pursuit, overconfident in his ability to intimidate Grace into submission through personal confrontation. Samuel's carefully planned traps had separated the mercenaries, and when Richard found himself alone in the forest, face to face with his wife, he discovered that his power extended only as far as his ability to inspire fear. Grace had looked into his eyes and felt nothing but pity for a man so empty inside that he could only feel important by controlling others. When she told him she would never return, would never again submit to his demands, he'd actually seemed shocked that she possessed the strength to refuse him. "You'll never survive without me," he'd said with desperate anger. "You have no money, no identity, no future. I have something better," Grace had replied. "I have love that doesn't hurt, and that's worth more than anything you can offer." The legal complications had proven less insurmountable than they'd feared. Richard's use of private mercenaries to track Grace had exposed him to serious criminal charges, and his business empire couldn't survive the scrutiny that came with a high-profile domestic violence investigation. When faced with the choice between pursuing his missing wife and protecting his financial interests, Richard had chosen to cut his losses. Grace's divorce papers had arrived by mail 3 weeks ago, along with a settlement offer that she'd refused. She wanted nothing that carried his touch, preferred to build her new life from nothing rather than foundation built on his money. Samuel climbed the porch steps, setting down the day's catch with satisfaction. 2 rainbow trout that would make perfect dinner, caught from the stream where Grace had first learned to fish with patience rather than desperation. "Any luck with the garden today?" he asked, noting the dirt under her fingernails and the satisfied expression she wore when outdoor work went well. "The tomatoes are finally taking hold, and I think we'll have more beans than we can eat." "Your grandfather's soil preparation methods really work." Samuel smiled, remembering Thomas's careful notes about crop rotation and natural fertilizers. Grace had thrown herself into learning subsistence farming with the same intensity she'd applied to survival training, determined to contribute equally to their life together. "There's something I want to show you," Samuel said, pulling a small object from his pocket. Grace looked down at his palm to find 2 rings carved from mountain oak, simple bands that glowed with the warm patina of careful craftsmanship. Each ring bore tiny carved symbols that she recognized from his grandfather's journal, Native American representations of eternal partnership and harmony with nature. "I know we're already committed to each other," Samuel said, suddenly seeming younger and less certain. "But I thought maybe we could make it official in our own way." Grace picked up one of the rings, marveling at its perfect smoothness and the way it seemed to warm in her hand. The wood carried the scent of the mountain forest, clean and honest and enduring. "When did you make these?" "I've been working on them since spring. I wanted them to be perfect." Grace slipped the ring onto her finger, where it fit as if it had been made specifically for her hand. "They are perfect." Samuel took the other ring and held it ready. Grace, who used to be Catherine but chose to become someone new. "Will you marry me according to the laws of the mountain and the wisdom of people who understand that love should lift each other up rather than tear each other down?" Samuel, keeper of his grandfather's wisdom and guardian of lost souls. "Yes, I will marry you according to any laws that matter." They exchanged rings as the sun set behind the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. No witnesses except the forest itself, no authorities except their own hearts, no promises except to love each other with the same respect they showed the mountain that had brought them together. "What do we do now?" Grace asked, admiring the way her new ring caught the last light of day. "Now we live," Samuel replied simply. "We plant gardens and raise children and grow old together in this place that taught us both what love really means." Grace leaned against him, feeling the solid warmth of his shoulder beneath her cheek. "I used to think love was about finding someone who completed you. But we didn't complete each other. We freed each other to become who we were always meant to be. Exactly. As darkness settled over the mountain, they stood together on the porch of the cabin that had become their sanctuary and their home. Grace thought about the woman who had stumbled out of the forest 9 months earlier, broken and afraid, and running from a life that had nearly destroyed her spirit. That woman was gone now, replaced by someone stronger and more complete than she'd ever imagined possible. Someone who had learned that true love didn't diminish you to make someone else feel bigger, but expanded your capacity to become everything you were meant to be. The mountains settled into its evening stillness around them, and Grace understood that she was finally, truly home. 2 years had passed since the wooden rings were exchanged on the cabin's porch, and Grace barely recognized the woman she'd once been. Her hands, once soft and manicured for social events, now bore the honest calluses of someone who worked with wood, soil, and stone. She stood in the expanded garden behind the cabin, admiring the neat rows of vegetables that would see them through another winter. The small leather pouch in her apron pocket contained seeds she'd carefully saved from last year's harvest. Tomatoes that had adapted to the mountain's short-growing season, beans that thrived in the rocky soil, herbs that had proven resistant to early frost. Each seed represented knowledge earned through trial and error, success and failure, the patient accumulation of wisdom that came from paying attention to what the land tried to teach. Samuel emerged from the workshop he'd built beside the cabin, wiping sawdust from his hands. He'd been crafting furniture for the trading post, beautiful pieces that brought good money and helped supplement their largely self-sufficient lifestyle. Word had spread about the quality of his work, and orders now came from as far away as Billings. "Mrs. Williams wants another rocking chair," he said, settling beside Grace on the wooden bench they'd placed to overlook the garden. "Says the one I made for her daughter's baby is the finest piece of furniture she's ever owned." Grace smiled at the title, Mrs. Williams. They'd chosen Williams as their shared surname, taking it from the old trading post operator who'd become something of a grandfather figure to them both. Pete Williams had helped Grace establish her new legal identity, asking no questions about her past and accepting the simple explanation that she'd needed a fresh start. "I've been thinking about children," Grace said quietly, watching Samuel's profile as he studied their thriving garden. "What about them? Whether we want them, whether we're ready for them." Samuel turned to face her fully, recognizing the weight behind her casual tone. "What do you think?" "I think about a child learning to walk on these mountain trails, growing up with clean air and honest work and parents who actually love each other. It sounds like a good life to give some." "It does," Samuel agreed. "But children change everything. No more dangerous situations, no more taking risks with our safety." Grace understood what he meant. Their life still carried elements of uncertainty. Although Richard had left them alone for 2 years, the divorce settlement had been complex, and there were still legal technicalities that could resurface. They lived somewhat outside conventional society, and that independence came with both benefits and risks. "Maybe that's not such a bad thing," Grace said. "Maybe it's time we became the kind of people who think about more than just our own survival." Samuel reached into his pocket and pulled out a letter that had arrived with the weekly mail delivery. Grace recognized the elegant handwriting immediately, and her stomach tightened. "This came today," Samuel said gently. "From your sister." Grace had mentioned Margaret only once, describing the sister who'd tried to maintain contact after Grace's marriage, but had been gradually cut off as Richard isolated his wife from family connections. Margaret had been 3 years older, protective and fierce, the kind of person who would have fought Richard directly if she'd understood what was happening. "How did she find us?" "Pete says a woman came by the trading post last week, asking questions. Professional looking but not threatening. Said she was trying to locate her sister, who might be living in the area." Grace took the letter with trembling hands. The envelope bore a return address in Denver and had been forwarded through the trading post's general delivery system. "Have you read it?" "Of course not." "It's addressed to you," Grace broke the seal carefully, unfolding pages covered in Margaret's familiar script. As she read, her expression shifted from fear to surprise to something approaching joy. "She's not angry," Grace said finally. "She says she's been worried sick for 3 years, that she knew something was wrong but didn't know how to help. She says she hired a private investigator to find me, not to drag me back, but to make sure I was safe. What else? She says Richard remarried 6 months after our divorce was finalized. Someone younger from what she's heard. She says his business empire has been struggling since the investigation, that several of his government contracts were cancelled when the domestic violence allegations became public." Samuel felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and concern. Richard's downfall provided a certain justice, but desperate men could become dangerous in unpredictable ways. "Does she want to see you?" Grace read further, her smile growing broader. "She says she understands if I want to stay hidden, but she'd like to know that I'm happy. She says she always hoped I'd find someone who deserved me. Do you want to see her?" Grace looked around at the life they'd built together. The garden, the workshop, the cabin that had become a real home, filled with love and laughter. She thought about the woman who'd stumbled out of the forest 3 years ago, lost and broken and afraid of her own shadow. "Yes," she said finally. "I think I'd like her to meet the person I've become." Margaret arrived on a Thursday morning in early September, driving a practical SUV that looked capable of handling mountain roads, but screamed city dweller in every other detail. Grace watched from the cabin window as her sister parked beside Samuel's old pickup truck, noting how Margaret sat for several long minutes before stepping out, as if gathering courage for a reunion 3 years in the making. When Margaret finally emerged, Grace felt her breath catch. Her sister looked exactly the same, yet completely different, still tall and elegant with prematurely silver hair, but carrying herself with the weariness of someone who'd spent years worrying about a missing family member. She wore hiking boots and jeans that looked brand new, clearly purchased specifically for this mountain visit. Grace had been clutching the small wooden cross Samuel had carved for her last Christmas, turning it over in her fingers, as she did whenever anxiety threatened to overwhelm her carefully built confidence. The cross wasn't about religion exactly, but about the intersection of love and sacrifice, about choosing to have faith in things that couldn't be proven but felt true in your bones. "She looks scared," Samuel observed, joining Grace at the window. "So am I." "You don't have to do this if you're not ready." Grace squeezed his hand. "I am ready. I think I've been ready for longer than I realized." She stepped onto the porch, just as Margaret reached the bottom of the wooden steps. For a moment, the sisters simply stared at each other across a distance that felt both enormous and insignificant. "Kathy," Margaret said tentatively, using the childhood nickname that no one else had ever been allowed to speak. "Grace," she replied gently. "I go by Grace now." Margaret's eyes filled with tears she'd probably been holding back for the entire drive up the mountain. "Grace, I like it. It suits you better than Catherine ever did." They met halfway up the steps, embracing with the fierce intensity of people who'd thought they might never see each other again. Margaret felt smaller in Grace's arms than she remembered, more fragile, and Grace realized that losing a sister had aged Margaret in ways that showed beyond the silver hair. "You look wonderful," Margaret said, stepping back to study Grace's face. "Different but wonderful, stronger. I feel stronger." Samuel appeared in the doorway, and Grace turned to make introductions with the kind of nervous pride that came from wanting the people you loved to love each other. "Margaret, this is Samuel." "Samuel, my sister Margaret." Samuel stepped forward with the easy confidence that had first attracted Grace to him, offering his hand with a genuine smile. "I've heard a lot about you. Grace talks about your childhood adventures quite often." Margaret shook his hand, clearly evaluating him with the protective instincts of an older sister. Whatever she saw in his face must have satisfied her, because her posture relaxed visibly. "And I've heard nothing about you, which tells me everything I need to know about how badly Richard isolated my sister from everyone who cared about her." The mention of Richard's name created a moment of tension. But Grace found that it no longer carried the power to shatter her composure. He'd become a character from someone else's story, a cautionary tale, rather than a living threat. "Come inside," Grace said. "I'll make coffee, and you can tell me everything I've missed." They settled around the kitchen table Samuel had built from local timber, and Margaret produced a manila envelope thick with photographs and letters. "I brought pictures," she said. "Mom and Dad's anniversary party last year, Cousin Jennifer's wedding, all the family gatherings where we missed you." Grace leafed through the photographs, seeing familiar faces that had aged while she was away, children who'd grown into teenagers, new family members she'd never met. The images created a strange sense of disconnection, as if she were looking at artifacts from a life that had belonged to someone else. "How are Mom and Dad?" "Worried sick about you for the first year, then angry that you wouldn't contact them. Now just relieved to know you're alive and safe. Dad says he wants to meet the man who convinced his daughter to live in the wilderness," Grace laughed. "Samuel didn't convince me of anything. I chose this life because it's the first one that ever felt true." Margaret studied the cabin's interior, taking in the handmade furniture, the preserved foods lining the shelves, the obvious signs of a life built with care and intention. "It's beautiful here," she admitted. "Peaceful in a way I didn't expect." "The mountain teaches you what you need to know about peace," Samuel said, refilling coffee cups. "But only if you're willing to listen." "Grace always was the best listener in the family," Margaret said with a fond smile. "Even as a child, she heard things the rest of us missed." Grace felt the wooden cross in her pocket, warm from her touch. "I'm learning to trust what I hear now, instead of doubting myself constantly. Richard made you doubt everything, didn't he?" "Yes, but that's over now. I know who I am, and I know what I want." Margaret reached across the table to cover Grace's hand with her own. "I'm proud of you. I'm proud of the woman you've become." Margaret stayed for a week, and by the third day she was helping with the evening chores as if she'd been born to mountain life. Grace watched her sister learn to milk the goat Samuel had acquired the previous spring, marveling at how quickly Margaret adapted to routines that had once seemed impossibly foreign to Grace herself. The old hand-forged horseshoe Samuel had found while clearing land for the expanded garden now hung above their door, positioned according to his grandfather's belief that iron shoes carried the protective spirits of horses that had worked honest lives. Margaret had asked about its significance during her second evening, and Samuel had explained the mountain folklore with the same quiet reverence he brought to all traditions passed down from Thomas. "Your grandfather sounds like he was quite a man," Margaret said, settling into the rocking chair Samuel had built for the front porch. "He was. Grace reminds me of him sometimes, the way she listens to what the mountain tries to teach." Margaret looked at her sister, who was hanging laundry on the line strung between two pine trees. Grace moved with economy and purpose, each motion serving a function, no energy wasted on unnecessary flourishes. The woman, Margaret remembered, had been constantly in motion, fidgeting with jewelry, adjusting her appearance, seeking approval through 1,000 small gestures. "She's found peace here," Margaret observed. "We found peace together. Neither of us was complete before. Tell me about the early days. How did you know she was someone worth saving?" Samuel considered the question while watching Grace pin a sheet to the line with wooden clothespins he'd carved during the previous winter's long evenings. She didn't need saving. She needed someone to stand beside her while she saved herself. There's a difference. Richard told everyone she'd had a nervous breakdown, that she was unstable and needed professional help. Some people believed him. Samuel's jaw tightened. She was the sanest person I'd ever met. Traumatized? Yes. Afraid, certainly. But her mind was clear about what she'd experienced and what she needed to escape. Margaret nodded slowly. "I always suspected something was wrong in that marriage, but Grace became so distant after the wedding. Every time I tried to visit, Richard had some excuse for why it wasn't convenient. Isolation is how men like that maintain control. Cut off outside perspectives, make their victim dependent on their version of reality." "How did you know so much about abuse patterns?" Samuel was quiet for a moment, watching Grace shake out a pillowcase before hanging it carefully on the line. My grandfather saw things during the war that taught him how power corrupts some people. He made sure I understood that strength should protect the vulnerable, not exploit them. Margaret studied Samuel's profile, noting the deep lines around his eyes that spoke of someone who'd learned serious lessons young. Grace is lucky to have found you. I'm the lucky one. She brought purpose to my life that I didn't know was missing. Grace finished with the laundry and walked back toward the porch, her face showing the contentment that came from completing necessary work well. She'd gained weight since leaving Richard, filling out into the healthy curves that belonged on her frame, rather than the sharp angles that had resulted from constantly suppressed appetite. "What are you two conspiring about?" she asked, settling onto the porch steps with the natural grace that had given her chosen name meaning. "Your sister was telling me about family," Samuel replied. "I was explaining why I fell in love with a woman who hangs laundry like she's performing a sacred ritual." Grace laughed, the sound carrying no self-consciousness or need for approval. "Everything here feels sacred when you pay attention to it properly." Margaret felt something shift in her chest, a release of tension she'd carried for 3 years. This was what happiness looked like, she realized. Not the performance of happiness that Grace had maintained during her marriage, but the genuine article, built on solid foundation and sustained by daily choices. "I have something to tell you both," Margaret said. "I didn't come here just for a reunion." Grace and Samuel exchanged glances, reading caution in each other's expressions. "What is it?" Grace asked. "Richard's new wife filed for divorce last month. Apparently, she discovered some of the same controlling behaviors that drove you away. The legal proceedings are getting messy, and his business partners are starting to distance themselves." Grace felt the horseshoe's presence above the door, iron protection against malevolent influences. "Why does that matter to us?" "Because she's accusing him of the same things you experienced. Physical intimidation, emotional abuse, financial control. If you were willing to testify about your marriage, it could help her case significantly." Samuel's protective instincts flared immediately. "Absolutely not. Grace doesn't owe that man's victims anything. And testifying would mean exposing herself to legal scrutiny and media attention." Grace was quiet, turning the wooden cross in her pocket while she considered Margaret's request. "What would testifying involve?" "Depositions, probably. Maybe court appearances if it goes to trial. But Grace, your testimony could prevent him from destroying another woman the way he tried to destroy you. And it could destroy the life we've built here." Samuel pointed out. Grace looked around at their mountain sanctuary, weighing the cost of involvement against the possibility of protecting someone else from Richard's cruelty. The horseshoe above the door caught the evening light, and she thought about protection that extended beyond personal safety to encompass broader responsibility. "I need time to think about this," she said finally. Grace sat alone on the ridge above the cabin, holding the worn brass compass that had belonged to Samuel's grandfather. Thomas had carried it through Vietnam and later used it to map the intricate trail system that connected their mountain to the wider world. The needle always pointed true north, regardless of terrain or weather, a constant in the midst of changing circumstances. 3 days had passed since Margaret's revelation about Richard's new legal troubles. Her sister had returned to Denver that morning, leaving behind a business card for the attorney representing Richard's current wife, along with a promise to support whatever decision Grace made. Samuel had made his position clear without demanding she agree with him. Testifying would mean exposure, risk, the possibility of having their quiet life invaded by lawyers and journalists, and people who saw Grace's story as entertainment rather than lived experience. But he'd also said he would stand by her choice, whatever it might be. The compass felt heavy in her hands, its brass case worn smooth by decades of use. Thomas had written in his journal about the importance of moral navigation, about finding true north when external pressures tried to pull you off course. "A man's character," he'd written, is tested not by easy choices, but by decisions that require sacrifice for principles larger than personal comfort. Grace had been asking herself the same question for 3 days. What did she owe to a woman she'd never met, who was trapped in the same kind of marriage that had nearly destroyed her own spirit? The answer felt as clear and unwavering as the compass needle. By the time Samuel found her on the ridge, Grace had reached the decision that felt aligned with who she'd become rather than who she'd been when fear governed her choices. "I'm going to testify," she said without preamble. Samuel settled beside her on the sun-warmed granite, noting the calm certainty in her voice. "Are you sure? As sure as this compass pointing north? If I stay silent, I'm protecting myself at the expense of someone who needs help. That's not who I want to be. It could get complicated. Media attention, legal scrutiny, people digging into our life here." Grace turned the compass over in her hands, studying the initials Thomas had carved into its case decades earlier. "Your grandfather faced much worse to protect people he'd never met. This feels like honoring his memory." Samuel understood then that her decision came from strength rather than obligation, from the confidence that had grown during their years together, rather than the guilt that had once driven so many of her choices. "What do you need from me?" he asked. "Your support, your love, and maybe your help preparing for what's going to be a difficult process. You have all of that, always." Grace leaned against him, drawing comfort from his solid presence while she planned for a future that would require more courage than hiding in the mountains. "I want to meet with the attorney first, understand exactly what testifying would involve. Then I want to talk to his current wife if she's willing. I need to look in her eyes and see if she has the strength to use my testimony constructively, and if she doesn't, then we'll help her find that strength. No one should face Richard Blackwood alone." Samuel took the compass from her hands, checking its bearing against the mountain peaks they'd used for navigation during countless hikes. "Your grandfather's compass," Grace said. "It's never led us astray. Neither has your judgment about people. If you think testifying is the right thing to do, then it probably is." Grace stood and brushed dust from her jeans, looking down at the cabin where they'd built their life together. From this height, their home looked small and vulnerable. But she knew its strength came not from size, but from the love and intentionality that had shaped every detail. "This place will still be here when the legal proceedings are over," she said. "Our life will still be here. But if we let fear keep us from doing what's right, we'll have compromised something important about who we are together." Samuel stood beside her, following her gaze down to their sanctuary. "Thomas always said that a life lived in service to others was the only life worth living. I'm not trying to save the world. I'm just trying to help one woman escape the same trap I fell into. That's exactly how you save the world. One person at a time." They walked back down the mountain trail, hand in hand, the compass secure in Grace's pocket, its needle pointing steadily toward the direction they needed to go. The path ahead would be difficult, but they would walk it together, guided by principles that mattered more than personal comfort. That evening, Grace called the attorney Margaret had recommended. The conversation lasted 2 hours and confirmed what she'd already known in her heart. Richard's pattern of abuse had continued with his new wife, escalating in ways that paralleled Grace's own experience. The legal case was strong, but would be stronger with corroborating testimony from his first wife. "I'll do it," Grace told the attorney. "Whatever it takes to make sure he can't hurt anyone else this way." When she hung up the phone, Samuel was waiting with coffee and the understanding that their quiet life was about to become much more complicated. "No regrets?" he asked. "None," Grace replied, touching the compass in her pocket. "We're still pointing true north." The legal proceedings stretched through winter and into the following spring. Grace had traveled to Denver 4 times for depositions and meetings, each trip requiring careful preparation and emotional fortification. Samuel accompanied her every time, carrying the small leather satchel that had belonged to his grandfather. filled with documents and mementos that anchored Grace to her new identity when the legal process threatened to drag her back into old patterns of fear. The satchel contained their marriage certificate, the deed to the mountain property, photographs of their life together, and letters of character reference from Pete Williams and other members of their small mountain community. Tangible proof that Grace Williams existed as a real person with a real life, not just as Catherine Blackwood's traumatic memories during the most difficult deposition, when Richard's attorney had tried to paint Grace as an unstable woman who'd fabricated abuse allegations. Samuel had watched her reach into the satchel and touch their marriage certificate. The simple gesture seemed to remind her that she was no longer the frightened woman who'd once lived at Richard's mercy. "Your Honor," Grace had said with quiet dignity, "I understand that Mr. Blackwood's legal team needs to discredit my testimony to protect their client. But I'm not the same person who was too scared to speak up years ago. I've learned what healthy love looks like, and I recognize the difference between truth and manipulation." The judge had been visibly impressed by Grace's composure under hostile questioning. Later, the attorney representing Richard's current wife told them that Grace's testimony had been the turning point in the case. Now they sat in the Denver courthouse waiting for the final hearing. Richard's wife, Elena, had filed for divorce and obtained a restraining order based partly on Grace's corroborating testimony about his patterns of control and intimidation. The proceedings would determine the terms of their divorce and whether criminal charges would be filed for domestic violence. Grace opened the leather satchel and checked its contents one more time, a ritual that had become second nature during their months of legal involvement. Each item reminded her of who she'd become rather than who she'd been. "Nervous?" Samuel asked, noting her careful inventory of their documents. "Determined," Grace replied. "I keep thinking about Elena, how young she is, how much life she has ahead of her if she can get free of him." Grace had met Elena twice during the legal process, recognizing in the younger woman's eyes the same trapped desperation she'd once carried. Eleanor was 26, barely older than Grace had been when she'd married Richard, with the same fragile beauty that men like Richard sought in their victims. "She reminds me of myself at that age," Grace continued. "Except she's fighting back instead of enduring. That takes more courage than I had then. You had the courage to run when running was the only option. Elena has the courage to fight because your example showed her it was possible." The courtroom doors opened, and Elena emerged with her legal team, looking exhausted but resolute. When she saw Grace, her face brightened with genuine gratitude. "Grace," Eleanor said, approaching with outstretched hands, "I can't thank you enough for what you've done. Your testimony gave me the strength to see this through." Grace clasped Elena's hands, noting how much steadier they were than during their first meeting months earlier. "You found that strength yourself." "I just confirmed what you already knew was true." "The judge ruled in my favor," Elena continued. "Full divorce, no alimony obligations, and the district attorney is filing criminal charges based on the pattern of abuse you helped establish." Samuel felt Grace's hand tighten on the satchel, but her expression remained calm. "How do you feel?" "Free," Elena said simply. "For the first time in 3 years, I feel free." Grace understood exactly what Elena meant. Freedom wasn't just the absence of an abuser. It was the presence of possibility, the knowledge that your choices belong to you again. "What will you do now?" Grace asked. "Start over. Maybe go back to school. Finish the degree I abandoned when Richard convinced me that wives didn't need careers. Figure out who I am when I'm not afraid." Grace reached into the satchel and pulled out a small card with their mountain address. "If you ever need to disappear for a while, if you need a place where no one can find you to think through your next steps, you're welcome in our mountains." Eleanor accepted the card with tears in her eyes. "You'd do that for someone you barely know?" "Someone did it for me once. It saved my life." They parted with embraces that felt like passing a torch from one survivor to another. As Grace and Samuel walked back to their truck, Grace felt lighter than she had in months. Not because the legal proceedings were over, but because she'd been able to transform her own painful experience into something that helped another person find freedom. "Ready to go home?" Samuel asked, starting the engine. Grace settled the leather satchel between them on the truck's bench seat, its weight now familiar and comforting rather than burdensome. "More than ready. I want to plant the garden, check on the goat, sleep in our own bed surrounded by mountain silence. Any regrets about getting involved?" Grace looked back at the courthouse where Eleanor was still speaking with reporters, using her voice to warn other women about the warning signs of controlling relationships. None at all. This was the right thing to do. 5 years after Grace first stumbled out of the forest, she stood in the cabin's main room, holding a tiny knitted sweater that Margaret had sent from Denver. The soft yellow wool caught the afternoon light filtering through windows that Samuel had recently expanded to bring more brightness into their home. Grace had discovered 3 weeks earlier that she was pregnant, and the news had transformed their quiet mountain life into something that hummed, with new purpose and gentle anticipation. The sweater was the first tangible sign that their child would have an extended family beyond the mountain. Margaret had included a note explaining that their mother had knitted it during a sleepless night after receiving the pregnancy announcement, working through her excitement and worry about a grandchild being born so far from conventional medical care. "She's beautiful," Samuel said. Emerging from the workshop, where he'd been crafting a cradle from cherry wood he'd been seasoning for 2 years. His hands still carried the sweet scent of wood shavings and linseed oil. Grace held up the sweater, imagining their child wearing it during the baby's first mountain winter. "Margaret says Mom cried when I told her about the pregnancy. Happy tears mostly, but also worried tears about us being so far from hospitals. Are you worried?" Grace considered the question while folding the sweater with care. "Sometimes. But then I remember that women have been having babies in remote places for thousands of years. We'll have Dr. Patterson from the valley, and if there are complications, we're only 2 hours from the hospital in Billings." Samuel set down his tools and crossed to stand behind Grace, resting his hands on her still flat belly. "Our child is going to be lucky growing up here." "Lucky how?" "Clean air, clean water, parents who actually love each other, and enough space to figure out who they're meant to be without constant outside pressure." Grace leaned back against his chest, marveling at how different this pregnancy felt from anything she'd imagined during her marriage to Richard. Then the thought of children had carried only dread, the certainty that any child would become another tool for control, another way to keep her trapped in a life that diminished her spirit. "I keep thinking about names," Grace said. "Something that connects to this place, to your grandfather's legacy, but also to the future we're building. Any ideas?" "Thomas, if it's a boy." "After your grandfather." Samuel's arms tightened around her. "He would have loved that." "What about if it's a girl?" "Hope, maybe. Or Dawn, something that speaks to new beginnings." They stood together in comfortable silence, both imagining the changes a child would bring to their carefully ordered life. The cabin would need modifications, baby-proofing, space for toys and clothes, and all the paraphernalia that came with raising a small human. But more than physical changes, they were contemplating the shift from protecting just each other to nurturing someone completely dependent on their wisdom and love. "Are you ready to be a father?" Grace asked. "I don't think anyone's ever completely ready. But I'm ready to try, ready to learn as we go." Grace turned in his arms to face him directly. "You'll be a wonderful father, patient, kind, full of practical wisdom. Everything I wish I'd had growing up. You'll be an amazing mother, strong enough to protect, gentle enough to comfort, brave enough to let our child make their own mistakes and learn from them." A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Through the window, they could see Pete Williams climbing the porch steps with his usual weekly delivery of mail and supplies. Grace quickly tucked the baby sweater into a drawer, not quite ready to share their news with the wider community. "Afternoon, folks," Pete called as Samuel opened the door. "Got some packages here, and a letter that looks important." The letter bore the seal of the state court system, and Grace felt her stomach tighten. With familiar anxiety, legal mail still triggered the defensive responses she'd developed during Richard's abuse, even though she knew he was now serving a 2-year prison sentence for domestic violence and financial fraud. Samuel opened the envelope carefully, scanning the contents before his expression shifted to surprise. "What is it?" Grace asked. "It's from the State Victims' Compensation Fund. They're awarding you a settlement for your testimony in Richard's case. Enough to cover medical expenses for the pregnancy and then some." Grace stared at the letter, processing the irony that her suffering at Richard's hands would now help provide for their child's future. "I don't want his money," she said automatically. "It's not his money. It's the state acknowledging what he took from you and trying to make partial restitution." Grace took the letter and read it herself, noting the formal language that attempted to quantify in dollars the damage Richard had inflicted through years of psychological and emotional abuse. "What should we do with it?" Samuel considered for a moment. "Set it aside for the baby's education. Transform something painful into something that creates opportunity." Grace folded the letter and placed it beside the knitted sweater in the drawer. 2 symbols of their child's future, one from loving family and one from painful past, transformed into resource for moving forward. Our baby is going to grow up knowing that difficult experiences can become sources of strength, Grace said, and that love doesn't hurt, doesn't control, doesn't diminish. Love creates space for growth. Outside, the mountains settled into evening quiet, and Grace felt their child's future spreading before them like a trail leading toward summits they couldn't yet see but trusted would be worth the climb. The snow began falling during Grace's first contraction, huge flakes that caught the lamplight and made the world outside their cabin look like something from a children's story. She stood at the kitchen window, one hand pressed against her lower back, the other holding the delicate silver baby spoon that had arrived from her parents the week before, with a note that simply read, "For our first grandchild, with all our love." The spoon had belonged to Grace's grandmother, passed down through 3 generations of family meals and first tastes of solid food. Its handle bore tiny dents and scratches that told stories of children who had grown up to have children of their own. A chain of love and nourishment that would now extend to include this mountain baby. "How far apart are they?" Samuel asked, checking the wood stove's fire for the 3rd time in an hour. Dr. Patterson had arrived that afternoon as planned, a gruff but competent country physician who delivered babies in remote locations for over 30 years. "Still about 20 minutes, Grace replied, breathing through another wave of intensity that started in her lower back and wrapped around her belly like a firm embrace. Dr. Patterson looked up from organizing his medical supplies on the kitchen table. "First babies usually take their time. We've got hours yet, most likely." Grace had spent months preparing for this moment, reading everything she could find about natural childbirth, practicing breathing techniques, and strengthening her body through daily walks on mountain trails. But now that labor had actually begun, she felt the profound mystery of the process. The way her body seemed to know exactly what to do without consulting her conscious mind. Samuel moved to stand behind her, his hands finding the spots on her lower back where pressure provided relief. "Remember what we learned about breathing through the intensity instead of fighting it?" "I remember." Grace leaned into his touch, grateful for his steady presence. "It's strange, feeling so powerful and so vulnerable at the same time." The next contraction arrived with greater intensity, and Grace found herself swaying slightly, following an instinct she didn't know she possessed. The silver spoon caught the light as she moved, and she thought about all the women who had endured this same experience, bringing new life into the world through sheer determination and love. "Your grandmother would be proud," Samuel murmured, noting the direction of her gaze. "I wish she could have met this baby. She used to tell me stories about giving birth to my father during a blizzard, how the midwife couldn't get through the snow and she had to rely on her own strength, and my grandfather's steady hands." "Sounds familiar," Dr. Patterson said with a slight smile. "Mountain women have been managing this process just fine for generations. Bodies know what to do if we don't interfere too much." As the hours passed and the contractions grew stronger, Grace found herself entering a state of focused concentration unlike anything she'd ever experienced. The outside world faded until there was only the cabin's warmth, Samuel's voice, and the profound work her body was doing to bring their child into the world. The silver spoon remained in her hand throughout the labor, something to focus on during the most intense moments. She traced its worn surface with her thumb, connecting herself to the generations of mothers who had used this same piece of family history to feed their babies. "I can see the head," Dr. Patterson announced suddenly, his voice carrying the excitement that came with witnessing the miracle of birth. "Just a few more pushes, Grace." Grace gathered her strength for the final effort, thinking about all the moments that had led to this one. The terrified woman who'd stumbled out of the forest 8 years ago could never have imagined this scene, surrounded by love, bringing a child into a home built on respect and partnership, connected to family who celebrated rather than controlled her choices. With a final surge of effort that seemed to draw on every ounce of strength she'd ever possessed, Grace felt their baby slip into the world and into Dr. Patterson's waiting hands. "It's a girl," the doctor announced, quickly clearing the baby's airway before placing her on Grace's chest. Grace looked down at their daughter's perfect face, noting Samuel's strong jaw and her own stubborn chin, features that would grow into character shaped by mountain air and unconditional love. "Hello, Dawn," Grace whispered, using the name they'd chosen for a daughter. "Welcome to the mountain." Samuel's eyes filled with tears as he touched his daughter's tiny hand, marveling at fingers that would someday learn to carve wood and tend gardens and make choices based on love rather than fear. "She's beautiful," he said, his voice rough with emotion. Grace held the silver spoon up where Dawn could see it, though her newborn eyes could barely focus. "This belonged to your great-great-grandmother, and someday it will belong to you. It carries the love of all the women who came before you." Outside, the snow continued falling, blanketing the mountain in pristine quiet. Inside the cabin, 3 generations of family history converged in the person of one small girl who would grow up knowing that love creates rather than destroys, builds rather than tears down, and always, always keeps its promises. Dr. Patterson finished his work and packed his supplies with satisfaction. Healthy baby, strong mother, and enough snow to make this birth story worth telling for the next 50 years. Grace smiled, understanding that Dawn's birth during a mountain blizzard would become part of family legend, a story to share when their daughter was old enough to appreciate the circumstances of her dramatic entrance into the world. Dawn's first birthday arrived with the kind of perfect mountain morning that made Grace understand why her grandfather-in-law had chosen this place to build his life. She sat on the porch steps, watching Samuel push their daughter on the wooden swing he'd hung from the massive pine tree beside the cabin. Dawn's delighted laughter echoed across the clearing, a sound that had become the soundtrack of their daily life. In Grace's lap rested the family Bible that had belonged to Samuel's grandmother, its leather cover worn soft by decades of handling. The book contained pressed flowers between its pages, markers from significant moments in the lives of people who had loved and lost and found meaning in the turning of seasons. Grace had been adding her own pressed flowers since Dawn's birth, creating a botanical record of their daughter's first year. "Higher, Daddy, higher!" Dawn called out, her vocabulary expanding daily as she discovered the power of words to shape her world. Samuel obliged carefully, mindful of safety, but willing to give his daughter the thrill of movement through space. Grace marveled at how naturally he'd taken to fatherhood, bringing the same patient attention to child-rearing that he applied to every other aspect of mountain life. The Bible fell open to a page marked by a pressed violet, The flower Grace had picked on the morning she'd first felt dawn move in her womb. She'd been walking the trail to Willow Creek when the baby had kicked strongly enough to make her stop and place both hands on her belly in wonder. Was I ever that small? Dawn asked, climbing down from the swing to examine a caterpillar making its way across the porch railing. Smaller, Grace replied, lifting her daughter onto her lap. You were tiny enough to hold in one arm, and you made sounds like a baby bird. Dawn studied the caterpillar with the intense focus she brought to everything new. Will it turn into a butterfly? If it's lucky and careful and patient, like me. Grace smiled, recognizing in her daughter's question the beginning of the philosophical conversations that would shape Dawn's understanding of her place in the world. Exactly like you. Growing and changing and becoming more beautiful. All the time, Samuel joined them on the porch, settling beside Grace with the easy contentment that had characterized their life together. Dawn immediately transferred to his lap, showing him the caterpillar and explaining her plans to build it a house from twigs and leaves. Your mother called yesterday while you were napping, Samuel told Dawn. She's coming to visit next week for your birthday party. Grace felt the familiar flutter of anticipation that came with family visits. Margaret had become a regular presence in their lives, usually staying for a week each season to help with various projects and to maintain her connection with her sister and niece. Will she bring presents? Dawn asked, with the directness that characterized all her communications. Probably. But the best present is having family who loves you. Dawn considered this seriously. I love Aunt Margaret. She tells good stories. Grace opened the Bible to show Dawn the pressed flowers from her first year. Look, here's the daisy from the day you took your first steps. And this rose is from when you said your first word. What was my first word? More, Samuel replied with a grin. You were eating applesauce and you wanted more. Dawn giggled, pleased with this evidence of her early determination to get what she wanted. Grace turned the pages carefully, showing Dawn other botanical memories. The wild lupine from the morning they discovered Dawn could climb stairs. The mountain laurel from her first successful attempt at feeding herself. The tiny forget-me-not from the day she'd learned to wave goodbye. Why do you keep flowers in the book? Dawn asked. Because flowers are beautiful for a short time, but pressing them makes the beauty last longer. Like memories, the good moments go by quickly, but if we save reminders, we can enjoy them again and again. Dawn reached toward a pressed aspen leaf, its golden color still vivid despite months of preservation. Can I pick a flower for today? What happened today that you want to remember? Dawn thought seriously, her small face scrunched with concentration. Daddy pushed me really high on the swing, and I saw over the treetops. And Mama showed me the caterpillar, and we're all together. Grace felt her heart expand with the simple profundity of her daughter's observation. Those are perfect reasons to press a flower. They walked together to the meadow behind the cabin, where late summer wildflowers created a tapestry of color against the green grass. Dawn chose a purple aster, carefully picking it with the reverence she'd learned to show for living things. Back on the porch, Grace placed the flower between pages near the back of the Bible, in the section reserved for Dawn's childhood memories. Someday, when Dawn was older, she would understand the weight of tradition represented by this book, the way it connected her to generations of people who had found meaning in marking time through love and loss and the changing seasons. When I'm big like you, will I have flowers to press? Dawn asked. You'll have your own book, Grace promised. And your own flowers and your own memories to preserve. Dawn nodded solemnly, accepting this glimpse into her future with the confidence of a child who had never known anything but love and security. 10 years had passed since Grace first heard Samuel say, "Come with me," beside the forest trail, and now she stood in the same spot, watching their 5-year-old daughter build a fairy house from twigs and moss. Dawn worked with the focused concentration she'd inherited from both parents, her small hands arranging natural materials with an artist's eye for balance and beauty. Grace fingered the worn leather bookmark that marked her place in the journal she'd been keeping since Dawn's birth. The bookmark had belonged to Thomas, carved with intricate Celtic knots that seemed to shift and flow in the changing light. Samuel had given it to her when Dawn was born, explaining that his grandfather had used it to mark important passages in books that shaped his understanding of the world. "The fairy house needs a garden," Dawn announced, gathering fallen leaves to arrange around her construction. "Fairies have to eat vegetables too." Grace smiled at her daughter's practical approach to magic. Dawn had grown up hearing Samuel's stories about mountain folklore and the spirits that protected wild places, but she interpreted these tales through the lens of a child who understood that all living things needed food, shelter and care. "What will you plant in the fairy garden?" Grace asked, settling on the moss-covered log where she'd spent countless hours watching Dawn explore the forest that had become their daughter's playground. "Tiny carrots, tiny beans and flowers for beauty. Fairies probably like flowers even more than vegetables." Dawn's face held the serious expression she wore when concentrating on important projects. She'd inherited Samuel's patience and Grace's attention to detail, combined with an imagination that transformed every walk in the woods into an adventure story. Grace opened her journal to the page marked by Thomas's bookmark, reviewing the entry she'd written that morning. The journal had evolved over the years from simple record-keeping to a detailed account of Dawn's development, family observations, and Grace's own continued healing from the trauma that had brought her to this mountain. Today, Dawn asked if all fathers are as gentle as her daddy, Grace had written. "The question reminded me how different her childhood is from my own, how she's growing up with protection that doesn't feel like control, love that doesn't demand payment, strength that lifts her up rather than pushing her down." The bookmark caught the afternoon light, its carved knot seeming to pulse with the wisdom of the man who'd first owned it. Thomas had believed that books were living things, that wisdom passed from one generation to the next through careful attention to words that mattered. Grace had tried to honor that belief by filling her journal with observations that might someday help Dawn understand her own journey. "Mama, look," Dawn called, gesturing toward her completed fairy house. "It has 3 rooms and a chimney and windows made from clear pebbles." Grace examined the structure with proper seriousness, noting how Dawn had incorporated lessons about architecture and engineering that Samuel had taught through their daily construction projects around the cabin. "It's beautiful. Do you think the fairies will like it?" "I hope so. If they move in, maybe they'll help protect our mountain from people who don't understand how to be careful with wild places." Grace felt a familiar surge of pride at her daughter's wisdom. Dawn had absorbed the values they'd tried to model, developing a deep respect for the natural world and an understanding that protection and stewardship went hand in hand. "What kind of people don't understand how to be careful?" Grace asked, curious about Dawn's developing worldview. "People who think they can take whatever they want without asking permission. People who forget that other living things have rights too." Grace made a mental note to record this conversation in her journal. Dawn's moral reasoning had been developing rapidly, shaped by stories about her grandfather Thomas's respect for all living things and Samuel's daily demonstrations of how to live in harmony with the environment. "Your daddy's calling," Grace said, hearing Samuel's voice from the direction of the cabin. They walked back through the forest, hand in hand, Dawn chattering about her plans to build a whole fairy village if the first house proved popular with its intended residents. Grace listened with the careful attention she'd learned from Samuel, understanding that these seemingly simple conversations were actually profound explorations of how Dawn understood her place in the world. At the cabin, Samuel was loading supplies into his pack for a trip to the trading post. "Want to come to town with me, little architect?" he asked Dawn. "Can I bring my journal to show Pete Williams my fairy house drawings?" "Of course." Grace watched her daughter run inside to fetch the small notebook Samuel had made for her, complete with blank pages for drawings and simple lined sections for her emerging writing skills. Dawn had been keeping her own version of a journal since she could hold a pencil, filling it with pictures and observations about mountain life, the leather bookmark warm in her hand. Grace reflected on how completely her life had transformed from the terrified woman who'd once stumbled through these trees. She'd found not just safety and love, but purpose and peace. The chance to raise a child who would grow up knowing that love was meant to nurture rather than control. Dawn emerged from the cabin with her journal, and Grace kissed them both goodbye, settling on the porch to continue her own writing while they were gone. The bookmark would mark this day's entry, another small piece of their family's ongoing story.